Hello again. So I want to be sure that you still have that energy from the morning. Hello again, everyone. Oh, fabulous. I love this song. For the final panel before the concluding remarks, so we have the distinguished member of the Africa Growth Initiative and Global Economy and Development Intelligentsia. So I'm very honored and grateful to have them, starting with Belinda Archibon, who is a fellow at AGI and who wrote the lead chapter on youth and gender for Foresight, youth and women in Foresight of this year. So we also have Ede Vasquez, who is our lead thinker on the questions related to climate change. And finally, Daniel Risnik, who focuses on democracy, also at the intersection with democracy, development, and debt. And we are co-leading a broader project on strengthening democracy in Africa. But of course, perhaps to begin with, Belinda, pathways to empower youth and women to be the driver of sustainable development. Can you expand on your preliminary remarks?
Okay. Thank you very much, Landry. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And Landry, please stop me, because you know I'll keep talking if you let me. I'll keep talking. So everybody go read my chapter. I think it's fantastic. Not just because I wrote it. Thank you. But very, thank you. Very briefly, 3 points to highlight: changing the laws, ensuring that you have access to jobs, and also ensuring that you have access to financial capital. So I will kind of echo some of the things that the great panelists and also the minister said earlier, but I want to focus more on the laws, because I think that changing the legal frameworks and changing the laws is not something I've heard so far, right? So what does that mean? So the minister mentioned this, I thought, very well said, about the key challenges that we have for women and for young people is thinking about access to financial capital, right? And ensuring that you have an environment that secures access to financial capital. However, you have that, goal, but within the institutional constraints of both the formal institutional constraints, where the laws might not be conducive to allow women, to allow young people to access these financial markets. When I say financial, think broadly, not just in terms of like actual money markets, but also in terms of jobs, but also in terms of housing, all of the things that we know. I'm an economist, that we know many economists in this room are necessary for increasing economic return. So there's that, but there's also the informal institutions, right? What we often refer to as the norms, culture, social norms, biases, that people will look at a woman or they will look at a young person and they will say, well, this person may not be as qualified, this person does not have the skills to be able to access these, resources. So ensuring that we have, for example, anti-labor market discrimination laws in place, right? I think every African country should have the equivalent of an EEOC, right? The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that you have like in the United States. A commission that says, hey, we are going to ensure that we look at the status of the labor market, we look at the status of women in the labor market and young people in the labor market, and we ensure that there is no gender discrimination coming from the employers, for example, against women. And we see this, like I have, if people want to come talk afterwards, we have papers, we have research studying this in the African labor market. We see that, women are less likely to be employed, and especially for senior roles within firms that then pay more, and then you can see how this is all compounding on the lack of access to economic capital. So that's one thing. The second thing I want to mention on the laws, especially, I'm from Nigeria originally, is on housing, right? And this, again, applies not just to women, but also to young people. Housing discrimination is something that is an issue in Nigeria and in many African countries. Landlords will refuse to hire or to rent, for example, to women. They will refuse to rent to young women and young people generally, but especially to young women, who are, do not have male partners. When we see the rise or the trend in urbanization in African countries, we're seeing a lot of young people, we're seeing a lot of young women moving from rural areas to urban areas. Why? Partly because this is where the jobs are, right? So you move, for example, you're trying to move from, the village somewhere in, where I come from in Edo State in Benin to Lagos, which is the city. You're trying to find housing, but you can't find housing because the landlord is refusing to rent to you because you're a woman, right? And especially because you're a young woman. How are you then supposed to access the job if you can't even find housing as a first stage? So ensuring that you have these laws against gender discrimination in the labor market, in housing, is going to be key, not just to changing the formal institutions, but also to changing the social norms, right? We have a lot of research showing that the laws can be very instrumental in changing how people view women, in changing how people view people from marginalized groups in general, including young people. Right? So I'll mention that and I'll stop there, but we can go into that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Belinda. Daniel, debt, development, democracy. What are some of the key lessons? Please, would you mind elaborating?
Okay, all right. Thank you, Landry, and good morning to all of you today. Yes, debt, I think, is one of the major concerns on the minds of many African leaders today, but not just in Africa. I mean, South Asia as well has been badly hit by debt, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh. But in Africa, we have at least 24 countries that are at high risk of debt distress or have already defaulted on their debt. Overall, we know the concern here is that, a lot of governments are having to now spend their money on interest payments instead of broader investments. So the most recent statistics from the World Bank, actually from last year, are showing that low and middle income countries in 2003 were spending more than $1.3 trillion on interest payments on debt, obviously diverting from healthcare, agriculture, education investments. I think in terms of the implications of debt, we've been looking a lot about the governance implications, and I think there's at least two considerations here. One is thinking about what are the accountability mechanisms that can be put in place to prevent such crises in future. Back during the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative in the 1990s, there was a lot of public sector governance reforms that went on throughout the region in order to prevent another crisis. And so I think the question is, were those not fully implemented? Were they abandoned during the kind of commodities boom that we saw in the 2000s? Or are they just not really fit for purpose given the changing landscape today in terms of debt, the more borrowing from non-Paris Club creditors like China and from commercial creditors. So there's a lot of consideration about what governance mechanisms could be more effective in managing debt going forward. And then secondly, obvious implications for democracy and democratic sustainability. When there's an economic crisis anywhere globally, populations start to obviously lose confidence in their government's kind of interest and incentives to deliver services. And I think for particularly democratic governments that now need to also cut spending and raise more revenue, they face a particularly difficult issue now. And we saw this very clearly in Kenya in the summer with the Gen Z protests, where populations feeling like the debt financing wasn't used appropriately on infrastructure projects, that there's been a layering of taxation for them over the years, and that governments are wanting even more taxation, really prompted a quite dramatic protest there. But that's not been the only country. We saw Nigeria with fuel subsidy reform protests. We saw Uganda with debt protests. Ghana had debt and environmental protests. And even looking at a place like Zambia, where President Hichilema has very patiently negotiated restructuring for 4 years, there's indications that Zambians are getting frustrated with lack of service delivery, particularly as they're facing an El Nino crisis. So I really see that the debt issue in 2025 up through the end of the SDG goal year of 2030 is going to continue to raise this interesting, challenging nexus between the debt, democracy, and accountability challenges.
Fantastic. Thank you, Danielle. Ede, Africa's climate adaptation agenda. So what should we pay attention to?
Okay, Landry, thank you very much. Great to be here with all of you. First message, there's no road to sustainable and inclusive development in Africa without resilience and adaptation. It's like taking 2 steps forward and 1 backward as soon as a climate shock hits you. And I don't need to list you all of the floods and the droughts and the heat waves that are hitting the continent in that process with increasing frequency and intensity. And let me link to what Danielle was saying. one of the challenges that African countries have is in debt. $164 billion of debt payments in 2024, which increased from $61 billion a decade earlier. And therefore, African countries get into a trap because so much resources need to be devoted for the emergency, the humanitarian response, the reconstruction, and the recovery after these climate-related shocks. And you know what? Part of the message in Foresight is that the glass is less than half full. Why? There are good news. The Baku COP finally said, okay, we're going to be moving from the $100 billion commitment from developed countries to developing countries per year. That was part of the Paris Agreement. And there was a lot of fight. Developing countries wanted 1.3 trillion, and they only got a commitment for 300 billion in 10 years. So it's a tripling, but it's nowhere near what is needed. For example, Africa right now gets about, if you count all of the flows, about $14 billion a year in flows for adaptation financing. But we calculated bottom up, and it turns out that they need about 100, so 7 to 8 times more. Okay, so even if the world develops and says 300 billion flows for climate financing, and actually of that, Africa gets about a quarter. Okay, and out of that quarter, guess what? About 2/3 goes for mitigation. I'm not saying that is bad. We all need to start working on mitigation, reducing greenhouse gases, but only 1/3 goes for adaptation. So it's a very small portion in that process, and therefore the glass is not half full. And even with the World Bank that was able to mobilize $100 billion with all of the financial architecture for IDA, and their commitments to do 45% for climate and half of that for adaptation. Those are important progress, and the African Development Bank is there in that process, but the glass is less of half full. And in my next round, I'll tell you why is it getting fuller and fuller and why there's so hope despite these alarming numbers that I'm giving you. Thanks.
You can go ahead and continue.
No, but I want to hear Belinda.
Go ahead.
Yeah, lots of stories. Okay, so look, what is really interesting, let me get back to Daniel's question on debt, okay? All right, flows to Africa for adaptation. How much is debt? You would think that Africa basically had no role in causing the climate crisis. Their emissions are minuscule. Historically, when you look, it's even less than when you compare to the big emitters, and they are suffering the consequences. But you know how much Africa needs to borrow for adaptation funding? Half of what they're investing. Half of what goes into adaptation funding are loans, okay? And even and in important sectors like transport and energy, the adaptation, the additional costs to get ready and resilient and more adapted to those shocks, they only get 14% of grants. So there's a massive need for grants. Second, it's not that African governments are sitting happy and waiting for resources. Actually, you know that African governments, from their budget, when we look at their budgets, from their budgets, they're putting as much money as the grants that they're receiving from bilaterals, which is just, first, shocking. Second, a reality that Africa is not going to wait to strengthen the resilience and adaptation of their economies because, as I said at the beginning, the road to sustainable and inclusive development has to be resilient and adapted to the new reality of climate change. Okay.
Fabulous. So, Belinda, so the Honorable Minister shared a few strategies about integrating young people and women in the political sphere. So would you mind sharing more strategy for economic empowerment as well?
Absolutely. So one of the things that, since we talked, I can see Georgie there. One of the things that she mentioned in terms of including more women in the political decision making, I absolutely think that affirmative action, we have very good research on this, works. Reserve political seats for women. Why is this important? We also have, Esther Duflo, an economist. She's a lot of Nobel Prize winner, a lot of research on this. When you do that, the preferences of women get represented in the political space. So things like access to potable water, access to safe roads, right? Because in many communities, women are the ones that have to walk in the road at night to go fetch water, right, for the communities. All of those things get prioritized, which is great for the community as a whole, right? It increases, these are key infrastructure that then increase economic development for everyone. When you have women in political office, we have research evidence showing that then you see these types of economic welfare enhancing policies being passed. So reserving seats for women, that's one. Second point I'm going to mention is on social safety nets. So building on what Ede mentioned in terms of the climate change and resilience, right? So part of my research is trying to understand the impact of climate-linked epidemics, right? So thinking of like meningitis epidemics, et cetera, on gender gaps in education and gender inequality more generally. And what we found, right, from past epidemics, from COVID, is that when these epidemics happen, women are the ones that are most affected. The most vulnerable populations are the worst affected. And that means you see widening gender gaps in education, you see widening gender gaps in the labor market. I don't have to tell everybody this, we saw this during COVID, right? Hopefully we don't have another epidemic soon, but the environmental health is not looking good. So we know that this is going to happen. And so what should we be doing? We should be, so this is an adaptation, we should be investing more in health infrastructure now. We should be investing more in social safety nets. We should make sure that, especially in Africa, where something like 20% of health spending comes from external sources, right? We have good financing that is devoted not just to pandemic preparedness, but to primary health infrastructure, right? To make sure that that's in place so that when we have, because we will have, unfortunately, again, according to the environmental health people, another epidemic, climate change, when we have another one, we ensure that the population is healthy. We ensure that women especially, right, that are also the ones that are doing care work in the households when you have sick, household members are supported because you have this investment in health infrastructure and because you have this investment in social safety nets. I will mention one more thing on the labor markets. I know, like, Landry is looking at me like, and now. One more thing on the labor market, just to give more positive, it is giving us positive things. I think it's really exciting. Somebody mentioned something about the private sector, right? And there are a lot of these like online hiring platforms across Africa that are, I'm working with one of them, the largest one in West Africa. There are some in East Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, etc., that are really working hard and doing very good work in improving the match between employers and skilled workers, including and especially women in Africa. And I think there is a lot of opportunity to have these like public-private partnerships where government subsidizes access to these platforms and so that maybe, for example, you have access to these platforms for people in secondary school, public secondary schools, public universities that can then really connect job seekers, young job seekers, young female job seekers, especially to these labor markets in a way that's very low cost, right? Because it's free. It's like, think of LinkedIn when I say online, like a LinkedIn or Indeed. Set up an account and just apply. It's cheap. It's easy. You don't need to know somebody, right? You can just apply to as many jobs as you want, and that will also help reduce both the gender gap in employment and then, of course, then improve economic outcomes for women and young people.
Fabulous, Belinda. Danielle, perhaps briefly, will you mind elaborating a little bit on the project on the Open Society Foundation project on strengthening democracy in Africa?
Yes, absolutely. So this project on strengthening democracy that co-leading together with Landry and institutional partners with the Institute of Development Studies in Kenya and the Center for Democratic Development in Ghana is an effort to try to better understand democratic resilience and vulnerability in face of different crises. And so again, like with debt, this is a topic that is globally relevant. We have many countries going through democratic backsliding or strengthening. But we're trying to look at 5 countries in the region as kind of archetypes of trajectories, including Ghana, Kenya, Mali, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Zimbabwe. So a wide-ranging spectrum. Some early findings are kind of, first and foremost is the importance of the underlying political settlement, particularly the relationship between political, military, and business elites, and particularly where these military-civilian relations are quite unbalanced like in places like Zimbabwe or Mali, we do see this kind of constant instability compared to other countries like Ghana and Kenya, where the military has largely been confined to the barracks. So identifying ways to strengthen military-civilian relations is really key. Second is, how you can take advantage of windows of opportunity. In the political space, we're seeing from this work, really critical junctures, how political leaders reacted to those shaped countries' subsequent trajectories, whether you're talking about the 2012 rebellion in northern Mali, the 2007 electoral violence in Kenya, the 2017 military ouster of Mugabe in Zimbabwe. These were all critical junctures, and how leaders responded had important implications. And then I think thirdly, the importance of institutions. We're really looking at institutions of horizontal accountability in the project. Two key ones are obviously electoral commissions and constitutions. Obviously, where the electoral commission is seen as not being independent, being overseen or housed within the prime minister or presidency office, there's obviously less confidence in the ability of elections to actually generate a legitimate outcome. Same with a lot of the constitutional shifts that we see that really upset the rules of the game and undermine confidence in the system. So going forward, we've taken this kind of more academic review of what's been happening across these countries, and now we're getting to the more kind of policy-focused interventions, what works and doesn't work, including drawing on civil society actions, like the More Integrity Electoral Consortium in Mozambique right now that's been instrumental in unveiling electoral malfeasance there. So we're really looking forward to having some practical implications for how to broaden democratic coalitions.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Danielle. Now we move to the Q&A session. So I will take 3 questions and we'll come back to the panel to conclude. So we have Pierre.
Thank you very much. I think this question goes to Danielle. Since this morning, we've been talking about democracy. And Nathalie Delapalme, who's the CEO of Mo Ibrahim Foundation, shared with us studies that show that there has been growing mistrust in democracy in Africa, and this is still since its inception, and also great mismatch between what the experts are saying and the actual opinion of people on the ground. Plenty of evidence show that democracy is not working, apart from some few exceptions that you mentioned. So my question is, isn't it time for us to take a pause and acknowledge that democracy has failed in Africa and start thinking about alternative models that better align with people's beliefs and aspiration, right? It doesn't have to be dictatorship, but we can certainly think about alternative models that build from, for example, local pre-colonial traditional political institutions. So what is your take on that?
And then, Izzy, if you can give the, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for a really very insightful panel discussion. My question is to you, sir. We know that 9 out of 10 of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world, 9 out of the top 10 are in Africa. And you spoke about you and your colleagues on the panel spoke about the mounting debt, 1 trillion plus that Africa is facing. We see new innovations like the climate for debt swap. Do you think these are effective in helping to start to address the problem? Are there other tools and financial innovations that you think could help, start to tackle this problem? Thank you.
So, in the back, and then you, and those will be the final question.
Thank you. I was just wondering, you were discussing legislation around biases against women and putting different laws in place to make sure that they're able to go into the right jobs or things that they deserve. And I'm wondering what the discussion around accessibility to justice is, because I know the most vulnerable people often might not have the time, the money to go through the justice system to actually receive, the compensation for the fact that they've been experiencing discrimination illegally. And so particularly in those areas, I was just wondering what discussion around accessibility to justice looks like.
And the final question just here.
Thank you so much. Dennis Owin from Uganda National Academy of Sciences. My question could also be related to debt, but specifically about climate change. How might the next Trump administration affect Africa's access to climate financing, considering the likelihood of the U.S. withdrawing from the climate Paris Agreement is very high?
Fabulous. So we have a question on local models of governance, vulnerability when it comes to climate, women, and right to job, accessibility to justice, and finally, how the new administration may affect access to climate finance. So let's have a maximum of a couple of minutes for each of you to answer the question. And this time we start with you, Daniel.
Okay, yeah, fabulous question. And I think, you know, it's again, this is not just an Africa issue. I mean, the Afrobarometer, of course, certainly shows dissatisfaction with democracy. The Economist reported on the Latino barometer showing the same thing in Latin America. If you even ask me, my satisfaction with American democracy would probably be quite low at the moment as well. And we just saw, you know, a tremendous election year last year where incumbents were ousted in many countries across the globe. So I don't know if there's something specific to the continent we're really looking at, or, you know, a revisiting of a real period that's coincided with economic crisis, a lot of disgruntlement with service provision, and, you know, a much more polarized a world out there. So there's a lot of kind of endogeneity, I think, in interpreting the public opinion polls. I think there's also a lot of, you know, higher expectations. Sometimes we show more disappointment when we have higher expectations of how a system should work. So I think, you know, over the last, you know, 4 decades where we've seen democracy taking hold in Africa, people have higher expectations of what it should deliver, and therefore can demonstrate kind of more disgruntlement with the public opinion polls. Certainly building on local traditions is, I think, essential, and we've been lauding, you know, Botswana. I mean, they have this very strong tradition with the Hotla system of inclusion and dialogue. In our study, we referenced, we've looked at tea drinking societies in Mali and how that's, you know, fostered different pockets of democratic consultation amongst communities. So I think that's absolutely right, you know, trying to build on those traditions. But they still have kind of the same, I think, ultimate essence of what we want with democracy, which is, of course, the theme of today is that kind of inclusivity, ensuring that there is some space for different, diverse constituencies to have a voice.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Ede?
So look, debt for swap instruments super important, but at the end they also need grant funding, and therefore an increasing in the grant portion of flows to Africa for adaptation is important, but it's equally important to have two mental shifts. First, adaptation should not be seen only as a cost. Okay. Oh yeah, we had to do this cost because the shocks are expensive in that process, and it should be really seen as changing productivity levels in completely different way. A farmer that has better weather information makes better choices and therefore is more productive. A farmer where the bridges are not washed away in the floods has high productivity because you're able to reach markets. So actually adaptation, when you look at it, and the benefit to cost ratios is as much as 4-to-1, and in certain investments 15-to-1. So flip it from this is a cost to this is an engine of growth. Second, let's move from saying adaptation and resilience is the government's responsibility and it's everybody's responsibility. And there's tremendous business opportunities that are just beginning to be realized, where the potential for entrepreneurship and business development and jobs for resilience and adaptation is enormous. Moving from this idea that green jobs are only for solar panels and electric vehicles to saying, look, it's about resilience and adaptation is a completely different shape. We run some competitions for entrepreneurs for resilience and adaptation businesses, and we have a really difficult time finding men with good ideas. Turns out that all of them come from women because my hypothesis is that culturally in Africa, the women are responsible for risk and resilience at the household level. Child gets sick, then it's there. There's not enough food. What is it that we're going to do? And therefore, the young women of Africa are beginning to get with all of these creative ideas of how to make business and how to make money out of adaptation and resilience. Second shift in that process. But it's same with the questions that you were having. Institutions and governance need to be ready. We analyze in Africa how many countries are really ready to have investment plans and businesses opportunities in adaptation, and there's only 6 to 7. So the same challenges that Belinda was describing are there, but let's flip it from cost to growth opportunities, and let's flip it from public sector to private entrepreneurship.
Fabulous. And last but not least, Belinda, a couple of minutes.
Okay, less, don't worry. So thank you, very good question. 2 things that are necessary. You have the laws on the books, but you need enforcement, you need monitoring, I should say 3, and you need people to have information, right, about how to access the legal system and what to do in terms of when, things happen, discrimination happens, what avenues that they can take. One of the things that is key, so let me give you, for example, a story that happened recently in Nigeria. There was a law in the books that, a local law that said if a female police officer got pregnant, then she would lose her job, right? Like you couldn't be a pregnant female police officer. This is completely against the Constitution, which is supposed to establish that we have gender equal rights, right, in the Nigerian Constitution. So the female police officer, she took the department to court, and she said this is a violation of the constitutional, rights that we know, are granted to women. And the court ruled in her favor and said, yes, actually, the fact that this precinct had this law on the books is actually like unconstitutional. So the fact that she was able to do that is because she had information, she was able to access the law, she was able to use, access to some of the privilege that she had as a police officer, get a lawyer, go to court, etc., to get that outcome. So things are changing, right? But slowly. But this is where I said the data and the information is important. And this is why I really, really like, I'm an optimist, aggressive optimist, some might say. So I really like the potential for technology to provide us with data about exactly what's going on the ground, right? Online labor markets, I think, are great, again, when you have these online hiring platforms, because we have access to so much data about every step of the hiring process. So we can look at the data and say, hey, there is actually gender discrimination going on in hiring, right? At this stage, at that stage, we can get very, very local and say it's in this industry, it's in this locale, in this particular time period, right? And so once you have that data, then you can say, okay, now I have the information, I can take that to a court to say, hey, there is actually discrimination going on, how do we solve that? Same thing if you look at with like banking. So Ede mentioned, it's true, like actually I think Africa has the highest share of female enterprises, female-owned businesses in the world, I believe. It's like 26% a share of female enterprises. I know, it's surprising, people are always like, oh, but oftentimes they're informal. So that means that they tend to be very small, they tend to be very unstable, and they don't have access to financing. And oftentimes they are facing bias in terms of the formal financial markets, right, which is why all the things I just mentioned exist. So they can't grow, they tend to go out of business quite quickly. And so being able to have data, right, from mobile banking, for example, mobile money would be amazing, where we can say, oh, we can see every step of the process. We can gather all this information. So if we see that a formal banking institution is discriminating against female entrepreneurs in terms of access to credit, we can then go to the courts with that information, with that data, and fight that, right? So just, anyway, data, technology, information, I think will vastly improve enforcement and monitoring, and then give everyday citizens the information that they need to challenge these things in the court.
What a beautiful way to conclude. So all the panelists should remain seated, and we will call now Ambassador Mathilde Mukantabana, the Ambassador of the Republic of Rwanda to the United States, for the distinguished concluding remarks.
Thank you so much. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I would like to express my appreciation to Brookings Global and the Africa Growth Initiative for this excellent platform and report. Foresight Africa sheds crucial light on our continent's journey toward achieving the Sustainable Development Goal. It serves as both a report card but also a wake-up call. Let me take this opportunity to thank you for this edifying conversation and appreciate you, Professor Landry. You always take the best conversations that are in our midst. As the report highlights, Africa is endowed with immense natural resources, yet this wealth has not consistently translated itself in a better life for our people. The SDGs are ambitious and transformative, but the outbreak of COVID-19, for instance, among other challenges, has hindered progress. But despite this, we are still optimistic on what we can achieve on our continent. The African Continental Free Trade stands out as a beacon of opportunity, enabling the free movement of goods, people, and ideas across our borders. We take pride in the progress this initiative has achieved so far and remain committed to the success. Rwanda, my home country, is a testament to this power of national strategy. Emerging from 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, we have prioritized strategic development through a national strategy for transformation. As a matter of fact, last year we just launched our National Strategy for Transformation 2, number 2. The plan focuses on job creation, export promotion, education, quality of education, public service delivery, and combating stunting and malnutrition. As President Kagame has often stated, Rwanda is committed to learning and sharing with African brothers and sisters in the true Pan-African spirit. We believe in an Africa with a united, respected voice on the global stage. We know that when one neighbor's house is secure, the entire neighborhood thrives. Today's discussion guided also in which our Prime Minister participated emphasized the urgency of human capital development, job creation, infrastructure, and climate action. These priorities, along with Rwanda's example in good governance and visionary leadership, accountability, offer a roadmap for the continent's collective progress. Africa's youth, dynamic population, and growing embrace of technology holds immense promise. To unlock this potential, we must strengthen partnerships among governments, the private sector, and civil society, fostering innovation and resilience for sustainable growth. In closing, I extend my gratitude again to all participants for their valuable contributions. Let us carry forward today's insights with bold action and shared determination, ensuring a prosperous future for all the Africans. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Excellency, for your leadership in bringing Africa at the forefront of the conversation, not just here in the United States, but globally. Now, for the final closing remarks, please welcome Professor Pierre Gimke, Director and Senior Fellow, the Africa Growth Initiative.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be very quick because I don't want to be the person standing between you and your lunch. And in addition to that, it's very difficult anyways to say anything much after a very distinguished figure as Ambassador Mukata Benda has spoken. So my name is Pierre Gimke. I'm a professor of economics and director of the Africa Growth Initiative. I am also a senior fellow at the Global Economy and Development Program here at Brookings. It's good to give credit where credit is due. So I only started here a few weeks ago, right? So that means everything that we've witnessed today, all the good things, the report, the convening, etc., has been put together under the interim leadership of Professor Landry Signé. I really have to say that Landry went above and beyond to make sure that we celebrate the 15th anniversary of Foresight in the most successful way, and I believe we did. So I would like us once more to join me
Thank you.
to congratulate Landry and the entire team of authors and contributors of today's event. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Pierre.
So we all came here today driven by a shared aspiration, making or building a brighter future for Africa. As the new director of AGI, I can pledge our continued commitment for evidence-based policy research grounded on rigor, scientific rigor, and cutting-edge methodology. I can pledge that to you. The 2025 Foresight Africa report and all the insightful discussion we've engaged in today provide invaluable guidance for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in Africa within the next 5 years. Now, my question for you is, where do we go from here? Yep, exactly. We move to implementation. So as my colleague John McCarthy was saying this morning, we need to move from the conceptual breakthrough to an implementation breakthrough. And I think this is the most important phase and potentially the most difficult one. So we must therefore continue to work together, collaboratively. We must engage to each other for this task to make sure that we translate this insight that we all got today into concrete actions that are going to make a real difference on the ground. So thank you very much. Thank you once again to all participants and distinguished speakers. Thank you everyone who joined online. I wish everyone a safe journey home, and I wish everyone a successful year ahead. Thank you.
There's no better way to conclude. And thank you so much, Pierre, again, for your extraordinary leadership. So, Excellency, perhaps, Pierre, if you can stay for a picture, and we have the other speaker, Ambassador, please, and Dr. Audio, if you can also join us. Raymond, so for the picture, Excellency.
Okay.
Please, Excellency.
You did a good job.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, everybody looking forward?